Hello, and welcome to our 23rd session of the Tech and Innovation Center series, part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. As folks join the Zoom and get settled in, I'll invite you to share your name, organization, and role in the chat. I am Tina Walla, and I'm interim CEO of US Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides technology support to governments. This series is part of the Local Infrastructure Hub, which aims to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of federal infrastructure funding by helping to create competitive winning bids that deliver real results for residents. This session is brought to you by Cornell Tech and US Digital Response and is supported by our funders Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, Kresge Foundation, and Waverly Street Foundation. Now, as you see here on the screen, I want to do a quick refresher on our values as a webinar series to ground you in today's conversation. We aim to inspire local government leaders, such as all of you, about the integration of technology that improves city infrastructure now and in the future. These 4 key values guide our series. So first, we're driven by shared goals. We don't believe in technology for technology's sake. Second, we want to design for people. Technology processes and products have to reflect the needs and desires of deeply diverse groups and individuals. We're not all the same. Third, we believe in approaching this work with a commitment to resourcing this work. And I think that this is a key theme that we're going to dig into today, given changes happening in the policy landscape at the federal level. We believe that we want to think about long-term sustainability. So for each of our sessions, we've been trying to think about long-term implications for workforce, policies, and regulation. And to name it, I think long-term funding is going to be something that comes up today in our conversation. Last but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Tech and innovation should deliver solutions that are transparent, secure, available, reliable, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. Now, on to today's topic. So today we're focusing on how cities can anticipate and adapt to disruption stemming from shifts in the technology and policy landscape. We're going to discuss some of the implications of federal infrastructure and AI policy changes, making decisions about AI procurements, and how cities can reduce risk. I'm really excited for this discussion because we're talking about a space where a lot is changing. I think that's an understatement. And we want to provide you with guidance that is both expert and practical. And I'm so excited. I feel like we have an all-star speaker lineup today that can do just that, give you both expert and really practical advice. I've seen each of these 3 folks do that, so excited for our discussion. But before we get started, we're going to take a moment, as we always do, and start with some poll questions to get a sense of who's in the room. These 3 questions that just popped up on your screen. Please take a moment and let us know how you're coming to this conversation. And as we get those responses in for the speakers, I'll invite you to take a quick look at the responses that come in, just so you have a sense of who's in the room. All right. So while folks are getting their responses in, Ryan, if we can go to the next slide, and I'll go ahead and introduce today's speakers. Thank you. Joining us today to share their perspectives are Santiago Garces, CIO for the City of Boston, Massachusetts, Katie Ruckel, the Chief Privacy Officer for my home state, the state of Washington, and Waldo Jakewith, Government Delivery Manager at US Digital Response. So before we get started, can we see the poll results? Let's see. Thank you. So let's just take a moment to take a look at this. Seeing a lot of 50% sort of have some uncertainty around grant funding. Get it. All right. Well, this is really helpful. Let's get started, and I'm going to start with Waldo, so we can take the slides down. Waldo has held several roles in the federal government over his career in different administrations, and he now supports state and local governments in his role at U.S. Digital Response. As we're talking, and we're a smaller group today, so I want everybody to feel really welcome to put questions in the chat, and then I'll invite you to come off mute to ask them. But Waldo, okay, let's start. I want to hear your perspective because we know that facts are changing on the ground on a day-to-day basis. But with that in mind, can you give us a sense of what you're seeing, what you've seen over the last month with the state and local governments that you support in terms of how some of their tech procurements are being impacted?
We've seen it's really a colorful last month. Of all the last months to ask this about, this has really been one. So in the past month, we've seen two big changes. We've seen the introduction of DeepSeek's R1 model, and then we've seen Trump taking office. Both of those are starting to have some significant impacts there. DeepSeek, like they have shaken things up. Just as OpenAI and Google and to a lesser extent Claude were starting to look like a settled market to somebody who wasn't paying real close attention. What it reminds me of is what we saw with cloud, where like AWS got a really big head start, and the question was like, who else is going to show up? How fragmented will this market get? Not. It's really just Amazon and Microsoft with a smattering of Google, at least at a government level, and then Oracle just to protest contracts they don't get, as far as I can tell. They don't seem to have a lot of like Oracle Cloud customers, and that's it. And that is where it has stayed for a while. And it was looking a bit like that to somebody less familiar with AI. It'd be okay, this appears to be settled, but not a settled market. And I've been trying to emphasize to our partners, like, this is going to change. I understand it feels like this is static now. It's not. So DeepSeek shows up. They, trained their model on ChatGPT, which is a bold move, reducing their cost of training a model to basically nothing. And that introduced a lot of uncertainty about, wait a minute, could these things be a lot cheaper? Can we get a lot of competition as they steal from each other, basically? But I mean, where did ChatGPT get their data from? They stole it too. So like it just theft, intellectual property theft all around. But the message to anybody just paying a little bit of attention right now is like, whoa, there was a big shakeup in the market, some Chinese thing, I don't know, but things seem to be different now. I think reasonable cities now would see why it's a bad idea to sign a multi-year LLM contract. You could look like a fool locking yourself into an inferior product or something that is way too expensive when the market can change so quickly. I don't think like cities are going to be signing contracts with a Chinese company to use R1. Like I don't think that's on the table, but the influence that has on the market is a big deal. And there was some uncertainty, and at least from what I'm seeing, that has been amped up. And the second thing I'll mention is that at a federal level, we're seeing the president's agency teams attempting to replace tens of thousands of employees with AI. It's not going to work. It's going to really badly. And it's going to make it reputationally risky to use AI in government, I think. I'm not psychic, but I'm pretty sure we're going to see some big failures on the front, and the blame is going to go, oh, it's AI's fault. Okay, well, the message to folks in a lot of government is, well, okay, maybe don't use AI at all, or certainly don't use it for important things. You probably shouldn't be using it for a lot of important things, certainly not load-bearing things without humans in the loop right now. But I think there may be an overcorrection there. So that's what I'm seeing in the way of those trends in the last month. And both of them are just increasing the level of uncertainty for the partners that I've been working with.
Yeah. Well, what are you seeing that folks then are doing to manage that uncertainty?
I mean, the number one tool in the public servant's tool belt, right? It's waiting. Yeah, let me hold off on this thing. Let's maybe not rush that. That's what I'm seeing is just a response of, okay, well, let's hold off. There's really not a lot of cases. There are exceptions, but overwhelmingly, there's not a lot of cases where it's really, really urgent that any city or state or municipality like adopt an AI tool right now. Like generally speaking, that's more on the, hey, what could we do with this tool end of things, and not, oh my God, we have this exact problem right now that can only be solved by this LLM tool or whatever. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's the tactic is cautious waiting.
I love it. Um, well, and last question before I want to hear how Katie thinks about this at the state level. But Waldo, despite these shifts and those two big ones you named just in the last month, I'd love to hear you sort of share from your perspective what remains consistent from before the last month in terms of how you recommend governments approach technology procurement. Because yes, some things have changed, and I would imagine that there's some things that just are more evergreen.
Yeah.
What do you think about in that regard?
There's been a protective message, but I think it's also a correct one from a lot of incumbents, technology providers to government, which is, whoa, you don't need to go signing a contract with ChatGPT or whatever. We're going to add that functionality to our software, the software you already use. So just hold up. We're going to get there. So for your procurement software or your application processing, like whatever it is that the software it is that agencies depend on, um, the idea is let the vendor enhance it with that functionality. A good example of where we've seen this in the private sector is how Apple has started using AI. There's no like chat GPT interface built into your phone or your computer, but they have baked in that interface in some really discrete ways,
Mm,
where they will have suggestions for things. They'll use ChatGPT to summarize your notifications in the corner of your screen, to summarize the emails in your inbox. Um, but it's not a chat interface, which ultimately I think is going to look pretty old-fashioned and goofy. That was just like the easiest way to get started with interfacing with LLMs. Um, that said, Apple's use of AI in the operating system has gone really pretty badly. Like mostly the headlines have been about how they've been embarrassed by those integrations haven't worked. They'll summarize a series of text messages that are, I think I saw an example, something like this. If somebody getting text messages from his mother saying she'd gone for a jog and she jogged by the zoo and she saw the bears, and the summary was like, your mother's being chased by bears. No, no. That's not what's happening here. But it's been embarrassing for Apple, and they've had to make these point releases to their operating systems for the iPhone and desktop computers to like put some disclaimers on that as it pops up. So what I'm seeing as a response is that's been consistent 6 months ago and again in the past month is, maybe we don't actually need a chat interface for AI as government employees. Maybe we need to hang on and see how this gets integrated. Because I
mm,
think it's going to look, AI procurement in government might eventually look like procuring copy and paste or procuring like a print button. Like, no, just hold up. All right. You have a printer. And I know your programs don't print because we're in this alternate reality in my example where like printers were just recently invented. But like, hold up there, print functionality is going to be added to computers. All right, just hang on. And I think this is reinforcing for folks and surely in private sector as well of like, we don't actually need to get an AI contract. Let's just hold up and let our standard vendors add that new functionality to their software.
mm. Okay, perfect segue. Thank you, Waldo. Katie. So you are the state privacy officer for the state of Washington, which not only is home to a lot of big tech firms that are delivering AI, but I know the state government is actively looking at how can we leverage it. There's a state task force in the state of Washington looking at this, and AI is one of those areas where right now, again, we're seeing some policy uncertainty. The At the federal level, the AI executive order was revoked. I think on day one of the new administration. So I'd love to get your take on how you're approaching this. One of the things you've accomplished is establishing privacy rules to prepare state agencies for AI. Does any of what's happening at the federal level affect what you're doing? And would love to hear you share about that, and maybe also what you're hearing from your peers in other states.
The I think what Waldo was talking about in terms of how we're evaluating procurement of AI, what we're seeing more in line in the state is that there's not procurement specifically for artificial intelligence tools like LLM models, but it's the seeing it getting integrated into products and contracts that we already have. And so the impacts of the federal rules, and it's funny, this is the third time I've been asked this question. I had to testify at our state legislature this past session about a lot of the foundational guidelines that we've put out for state agencies. And one of the questions was, has the change in the executive order changed the state's approach? And it really hasn't, in that the federal executive order was really focused on a lot of very high risk activities and red teaming of like very compute intensive type models and those types of things. And of course, we want to pay attention to those risks. But where we are at a state is we're looking we had a governor executive order that asked for a litany of I guess, artifacts that are now published to help state agencies think about the best way to procure and deploy AI responsibly. And where we really leaned into some of the federal guidance is on the NIST side and the NIST AI risk management framework and those principles that come with that. And so those principles are really what we're, when you talk about some of the privacy rules we've highlighted for state agencies to think about in terms of evaluating whether AI or generative AI is an appropriate solution. I love your principles where you were talking about in the beginning, like not just buying technology and using technology for technology's sake, but actually using a technology that's going to help and serve the public for Washington. That's how we think about it. So we actually added public purpose and social benefit to the principles from this, just because we see that as a responsibility for state government if we're procuring and using artificial intelligence. So those are some of the principles and guidance that we have available for procurement, and then also why the revision of the executive order at the federal level didn't really impact us that much.
Yeah. As a Washingtonian, I love hearing that y'all are continuing, continuing to move forward, and that integration of things like considerations like social benefit. That's great. Katie, one reason I was so excited for you to join us today is I heard a great presentation you gave at last October's NASCIO conference. NASCIO is the National Association of State CIO Officers, for those not familiar. And you shared some super practical guidance to both government leaders in the room, but also to technology vendors about things to keep in mind when entering into AI-enabled procurements. You highlighted really important and unsexy things like public records, which for any of us who have worked in government, we think about all the time. In a moment, we're going to talk to Santi. He could probably rattle off how many public records requests they're dealing with right now. Katie, related to that, can you share, 2 or 3 pieces of practical advice for folks on today's call for when they are thinking about AI-enabled procurements?
Yeah, and the public records piece is actually a very hot topic for us in Washington. Every legislative session, there's a lot of talk about what's exempt from public disclosure and what's not. And people are very curious about how AI is being used and what's happening, behind the scenes. And that really gets to some of the transparency principles. And so we've already been getting a lot of requests just in terms of, I don't think this is necessarily an AI tool, but like our Teams chats is a hot topic in Washington that's been getting some attention because they were getting deleted because they were intended to be transitory, and that was a concern. And so now we sort of hit a pause on that, and we're looking at making sure that we're using that type of technology responsibly and keeping the records we should be. And so that really gets into the whole conversation that we have about whether or not prompts are transitory or are those public records that need to be kept, and some of the audit logs that may come with some of the uses of those technology. And so that's what we were talking about in terms of the consideration. Think about of using these tools, think about the records that you're collecting, whether they're exempt from disclosure or whether or not they'll need to be produced, because we have gotten into a habit of recording and transcribing meetings, which for the state government are all public records. And those are conversations that didn't used to be recorded and produced. And so we're just trying to help the workforce be mindful in terms of when it's appropriate to record and transcribe, and whether those records would be exempt from public disclosure, or whether or not you would have to go through the records and redact any sensitive material, which is a workload issue for our records officers.
Yeah, thank you. I'm remembering you mentioned this exact point at the NASIO conference, and I saw this look of panic. And there were some questions specifically from some vendors in the room who said, wait a minute. So, because your advice was, hey, just be mindful when you start recording. Like at the top of a meeting, when you're, engaging in some chit chat, you might be sharing what you did over the weekend or sharing something that you don't want transcribed. And you saw this like, whoa, aha moment, which again is something small, but I think you really helped open folks' eyes to how our existing regs sort of come into play here. Okay, Santi. Santi, let's get the city perspective. First, I just want to invite you, if there's anything that Waldo and Katie have spoken to that sort of has sparked anything for you, would love to invite you to speak to that. Otherwise, I've got some questions for you as well.
Yeah, I think I agree and disagree with some of the things that Waldo was saying. I think so the first piece would be, generally when we're thinking about large language models and these large multimodal models, we're basically talking about getting access to math, to like particular sets of mathematical equations, these like weights and whatnot. And so I think like the piece that I would say is like generally, because particularly I'll start focusing first on large language models. A large language models requires really large computational capacity to run, even just one model. To load the, I mean, we don't know with ChatGPT because it's, it's not an open model, but there's an estimate that running ChatGPT 04 requires 10,000 GPUs just to load the model. That's where you're seeing this like massive investment in capital, but even the project Stargate that Sam Altman was announcing at the White House is partially because Microsoft wasn't able to keep up with the capacity of constructing data centers to run inference. And they're starting to partner with Oracle to build the data center. So the point being, no one, like there's only, because it's so capital intensive and it requires so much technology, it really, when we're talking about getting access to large models, you're talking about getting access to services that are being productized through existing cloud providers. So if you want to get access, so you're basic, and it's similar to, if you want to get access to cloud or some of these things through AWS, you use Bedrock. The same way that if you needed to use storage, you'd use S3 buckets in AWS, but there's equivalent services in GCP and in Microsoft. So the main thing around procurement is because most of these access to these cloud computing services are available through either GSA contracts or through NASPO value point contracts. Like almost any municipality or any state government can access these tools without having to do an RFP. You could just go and buy it now. And in fact, even the companies that are selling features that leverage these tools are likely using these tools in the back end to access, because again, it's just like economically not very feasible for someone to be running these like large models. So what they might be doing is running smaller models, so that require less computational resources that tend to be less robust. You get less, a little bit worse performance. And what we're also starting to see is some trends around like how vendors add some of these features into their products. So like you had like Google started marketing kind of their version of Copilot of Gemini within their workplace, and they were charging an additional, I think it was like $20 per user per month. And part of the challenge is like, this is all very new, not only to government, but to the companies that are selling these things. And I think that what they started to see, I could talk more about like what we're doing, but generally what we see in Boston and what I've heard other governments experience similar things. When you give access to these tools to your employees, you see kind of this long tail distribution of usage. A few people use it very frequently, like the majority of people use it a few times, and then most people use it once and then they forget that it exists. And the challenge is because it's expensive. It's much more expensive to use a large language model than it is to render a website or than it is to store like a gigabit of data on the cloud. It is expensive. So I think that this is where so you saw Google then changing the pricing strategy and then going and saying, no, you'll just pay $2 a month more for all licenses and everybody's going to get access for Gemini for the next like few years. So the point being is like the technology is changing, the business model is changing, and I think the piece that there's parts like when it relates to I'll stop there and let you ask me hard questions around like how it relates to the federal government policy and other things. But that just says like, but I just feel like anyone can go in government could go and buy it even without going out to procurement. It is just a feature or a piece of something broader of how you go and configure that you can put in an application, and that's how we think about it. It's like a component, a piece of functionality. And I would just say it is one that could be incredibly helpful at being able to deliver new experiences or do work that is of value to the residents.
I want to come back to where you were going, but let me ask, like, for a city like Boston, how is this unique time of uncertainty, I'll call it, how is that playing out for planned procurements that you'll have in Boston? Because I would expect that like there's some similar concerns related to, well, like what's going to happen with federal funding and like policy guidance, but like to the extent to which you can share, would love a glimpse into how y'all are navigating these types of procurement challenges in Boston.
Yeah, I would situate it within the context of a project that is received funding from the federal government. So we apply for a $2 million first stage SMART grant program from USDOT. And the grant is intended, in Boston, we have a lot of very confusing signs in the street where we tell people whether they can park at what times and what could they be doing when they're parking. And it's confusing. And part of the challenge is we don't always have the record that we have of the fact that there's a sign doesn't contain the regulation. So we also don't know what the sign says against what we think the regulations are. So we got funding to this $2 million to basically tie these things together. And at this point, we're trying to, so the main piece of uncertainty is like, do we have the funding? You know, this was one of the programs that had been frozen, and then we think that it's still going on, and we hope that it keeps going on. Again, we think that this is something, being able to use technology to provide a better experience for any constituent trying to figure out where they can park seems like a very valuable thing that very nonpartisan, good thing to figure out. So where AI comes in, we would likely end up so we have two approaches that we've considered, like a classical machine learning approach, and then one leveraging these large multimodal models. In the classical machine learning model, and I'll get a little boring and technical, we would probably go with some machine learning process where we do like segmentation, basically try to isolate the street signs, trying to figure out some way of matching, making sure that we're looking at the right sign, being able to extract the text, some level of classification. Obviously, because it's Boston, none of the signs are standards. The signs are different across different neighborhoods. So I have to do a little bit of parsing because one sign might contain different kinds of regulation. And then eventually getting to the point that we've extracted, parceled the regulations and build a rules engine that allows us to know what regulation applies at what particular point in time. great, a lot of work. We need highly specialized people when we're hiring data scientists to go and build these things. And obviously, whatever the work is 10 times more complicated than I always think it is. But that's one approach. The other approach is using generative AI and these multimodal models where you could take a picture of the sign or use the pictures that we have of our signs and go and say, what regulation exists in the sign? When does it apply? And the thing is that it kind of works. So we've done some experiments a little bit with both. So the amount of time that it takes to actually go and engineer something that produces the same outcome is much simpler. Now, what we're trying, the point that we're at is trying to figure out how replicable, like how is the performance robust enough? Like, does the tool give us the same level of performance? And we know that the unit cost of analysis is probably going to be higher than in the Gen AI world than in the classical machine learning mode. From a procurement standpoint, we're not really worried because again, we were never gonna buy the GPUs. We're not gonna buy the models and like instantiate them because also like even if we went and we bought these things, like we don't use them all the time. This is like where the beauty of the cloud is when it's someone else's computer, you're also hedging. You don't have to use it all the time to make the economics work. Use it when you need it. And in this case, we won't need it all the time. So that's the other thing that is like generally when we're building and architecting things that use large language models or these multimodal models is like, because we're trying to be savvy around the cost, we try to build things where we do inference once, but then the work product can be like produced multiple times. So we were, again, from a procurement standpoint for us, we were always going to be using one of the major cloud providers, using kind of like one of these like edge foundational models. And what we were where we're in the process of doing, hopefully figuring out like what happens with the funding is validating the effectiveness and the cost efficiency of each approach in a smaller scale so that then we can decide which way we want to go. But from a procurement standpoint, we would be using probably some cloud resources from a major cloud provider, regardless, for the storage of the pictures, for running the compute and the inference on both ends.
Mhm. Okay. Well, on that, I want to invite Katie and Waldo, like with what Santi's describing, I want to hear like your perspectives on that because I thought it was interesting the way he framed, like you can get to the same outcome in two different ways. Would love to hear what considerations y'all would encourage cities like Boston, but then other cities that watch this webinar to consider as well.
I
They're
was
both being
going to defer to
gracious.
Waldo first, and then I'm happy to pipe in.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just call up that there's such an enormous difference in the physics generally between large and small municipalities. Like just inherently that's true, but very much so for the maturity here as well. That when I work with smaller municipalities, with a population of 100, 200,000 people or whatever, often they just want to know like, where do they buy some AI? Like, can they just get some of that? Like, where do they sign a contract? Because somebody told them they have to buy some. So how do they do that? And it's, my job to say, what are you trying to do with it? What are you trying to accomplish? Well, the answer is usually something like, we need to get AI. Okay, sure. And so I try to convince them, like, please don't just go to like your Microsoft reseller or whatever and say, can you please get us some AI? Because it's going to cost you an absolute fortune. Could you just sign up for a ChatGPT account? Is that going to make somebody happy? Can we like start with experimenting there? And occasionally I will have success and they'll be willing to just try that out for the, $25 a month, I think, per user for their multi-use licensing and test a thing. And that way they've done it. But usually I fail. Usually they want like the easy button. It doesn't matter how much expensive it is in comparison. They want to know that they can just pay a vendor to make this happen for them, which is a totally reasonable thing. Like they shouldn't have to be experts in AI and know about different models and who sells whom. They just want to be able to make that thing happen because their boss's boss said that it needs to happen. But even if they had a really good use case, they actually really needed, image recognition or train something, whatever it is that they're trying to do. They also shouldn't have to become experts on this. They really should just be able to buy off the multiple award schedule from GSA, or go through an ESPA value point, or just whoever their existing reseller is for Microsoft stuff, knowing they can go through that for OpenAI, whatever it may be. My sympathies lie with them. I understand that they're the demands placed on them and some of the enthusiasm has outpaced the simplicity in procurement that they're looking for. But to Santiago's point, they can get there. Maybe not quite as simply as they would like to get the whatever changes they want to demonstrate happening. They really have to depend on their software vendors for that ultimately. But what I really try to emphasize is this isn't hard. You don't have to make this hard. Procuring this can be very, very easy. Please make it easy, but also please don't sign up for a $10,000 a month contract. You don't need to do that.
Yeah. And to the point you made earlier, don't sign up for one that then locks you in for multiple years, because this technology is changing constantly.
Yeah, I would actually add too. I appreciate, Santiago, your point about the cloud model of paying by the drink, where you shouldn't have to sign up for a 3-year contract for X $1,000 a month. You should be able to pay by the query. And that's just not something that enough, certainly smaller customers, really have the maturity to understand yet.
And if I can jump in at I think that this is the place that if you see the trend, the performance of smaller models are getting better. To your point about DeepSeek, there's more competition. So I think that it is helpful to go and familiarize yourself. I feel in some sense, these large language models are a little bit like cell phones in the early 1990s. They're big, clunky, not very reliable, but they seem cool. So knowing how they kind of work and when it could be helpful is not a bad thing. You just maybe don't want to rely is the only thing that you want to think about. But I do think that over time you're going to see a lot of improvements. And I think trying and testing, and this is where being explicit with your constituents. I think that is the piece about the federal, when the current administration rescinded the previous AI executive order. I think it's a little bit short-sighted the piece about bias and fairness, which are technical terms, not only social terms in the case of a model, is you wouldn't want a Tesla that can only be driven when it's sunny. You wouldn't want to use an AI model that for access to a building that cannot detect people with dark skin color. Why? Because it just doesn't work. It'll be annoying and frustrating to people that should be benefiting. So it's just less good of a technology if it cannot work for all of the people that it's supposed to serve. So it's not just about values, it's also about the quality of the system. So it's again, in the quest of changing what value system are you saying, I think that it's a little bit short-sighted of going in and rescinding stuff that is actually helpful in thinking about is it that we make models that are more robust and being able to put them in operations where and we expect everybody to be able to get served by government equally. So why is that a bad thing?
Katie, I want to invite you if there's any thoughts sort of bubbling to mind for you on that thread.
Yeah, well, I would say that some of the evaluation on cost, benefit, and use cases is precisely how the state has been operating and looking at, how expensive it is to, build your own thing versus just being able to test in a smaller environment with a smaller sort of data set and then cull that data set. We've had a lot of good learning from the agencies in terms of different use cases. And we've set up a sandbox environment too for testing on some smaller areas so that it's not an all or nothing sort of big contract, and really trying to evaluate the cost benefit that Santi was talking about, especially leveraging some of our cloud contracts and those types of things. And so, which we already have. And so that's what's been, I think, useful. In terms of my lens, which is privacy. So where I'm watching, I get pulled into a lot of these conversations, mainly because there are concerns about the processing of personal information, you know, in these types of AI models or automated decision systems, those types of things. But I would say that most of the use cases that we're looking at testing, like the signage example in Boston is perfect. We're using it for different environmental purposes, like scanning eelgrass or for environmental reasons, and wildfire detection and those types of areas. And then that's where we're having the conversation in terms of those contracts about whether we want, if we're working with the vendor, the vendor to be able to learn and train their model on our data versus only segregating our data and using it for our purposes. And that gets into some of those areas where I get brought in for conversations around the type of data, what the risks and benefits are of letting the vendor use it for their own purposes and training versus what needs to be, you know, just protected and part of Washington's environment. So that's just a little nuance that I think we have in terms of the conversations and the use cases at the state.
Anthony, I think there were some questions you had. Let me invite you to throw one out.
Yeah. So the first one, I just wanted to sort of explore some of the connections back to federally funded city infrastructure projects. I think Santi was talking about, you know, what about all the technologies that, like the less sophisticated, sort of more familiar kinds of AI, but still very problematic in many cases. So like risk scoring algorithms, computer vision, facial detection. You know, a lot of these kinds of solutions are baked into infrastructure projects that cities have, like at different stages of planning, funding, implementation. And I'm just curious, like, are some of the things that are changing in the tech and policy landscape potentially triggering a need to go back and look at what they have baked in for those projects? You know, just on the sort of simplest concern of, like, you know, the way they're classifying certain kinds of people or behaviors. How do they assess sort of what their exposure is and what risks might be coming down the road?
So asked about using risk scoring as a part of what the state services are doing. That's actually a conversation we're having currently. And so part of that evaluation is understanding the capabilities of the technology in terms of the false positives and false negatives that you get, just because you don't want to have it so restricted that people that need to get into their systems and services that they need to access are getting denied, and then that turns up the customer support sort of costs that we end up dealing with. Plus, you don't want to end up making things harder for people to access benefits or services based on, wherever they may be trying to access services from. So there is sort of a fine tuning that comes with that. And it's the same with using of biometrics, facial recognition technology, those types of things. For the state of Washington, we have a very prescriptive facial recognition law that requires a lot of API testing and community consultation before you can even leverage those technologies. And so that's where we build in some of those safeguards. So those are some of the more sensitive use cases that we see in high risk. That would go in the high risk bucket, right? For deploying AI, that we would definitely be assessing impacts and making sure we're fine tuning any of the analytics that are occurring.
Can weigh in. I think that, again, this is where finding the right tool for the right job is the constant pursuit of an engineer. So I think that this is where, like if there's a tool that is less expensive, like large language models are not the only way of doing certain things, and then it's just a matter of understanding whether, like, the risk is appropriate and the performance is appropriate. But I remember trying to do a computer vision projects when I was in undergrad and trying to do segmentation, whatnot, and they're like actually really poor performance. It's very hard to do it, and it didn't work very well. And now you see things like YOLO, you see this like segment anything from Facebook, from Meta, and they're amazing. So it's just like I think that there's a lot of tools that are available. And actually, what the twist that I would put is if you use generative AI to do coding, you can actually leverage some of these tools that are like classic machine learning tools that are a little bit less expensive to run faster and more effectively as well. So again, I think generally for us, like the main piece that says like similar to Katie's approach, like we think about like privacy and security and governance, all like for us, AI is not a different thing that needs to be treated differently, just like holistically, like when we think about controls, the same type of controls that we are concerned about in any of our cloud environments, like do our S3 buckets secure? They're like accessible to anyone in the internet. That's the same level of concern that we should think about as if we were pushing data into GPU to run a large language model that we are not sure how the data is going to be handled and stored and so on and so forth. So like I think that this is where like being thoughtful about those pieces. But I just reiterate, we find that these tools, especially the new emerging tools, are helpful. Like I'll give you an example. Last summer we started to test. The city has a language access ordinance, so we are mandated to translate everything in 10 different languages. And two of the languages that we translate things into and translate from are Cape Verdean Creole and Haitian Creole. And they're languages that are not spoken by a lot of people. So generally the translation systems from kind of off-the-shelf models is not great. And with our Office of Emerging Technologies last summer, started working with Google Summer of Code Fellow to tune translation models using data that we have, because we have a lot of data, things that are translated in all these different languages. And we were getting confirmation from native speakers. So this is another great way of like engaging with human beings. So the ultimately people that speak those languages are the only one who are going to be able to tell us if the translations are good or not. But tuning large language models for translation perform much better. And actually what we notice is that the rate at which bad translations occurred diminished when we were using tuned large language models as opposed to the commercial off the shelf. So there is value to be had. It's just we need to find what it is and to weld those problems. It's not just like just buy the AI solves my problems. Is like how do we use the right tools to solve the right problem, and then meanwhile bring people along to build trust as we do it.
Yeah, the natural language services is an area too that the state is looking at. And I love that example where you are engaging, especially with the community impacted and having them come in and help do some user testing and feedback for fine tuning the model. That's very closely aligned with the guidance that we put out in terms of community engagement and involvement at the state of Washington.
Oh, Anthony, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. As we reach the top hour, I just wanted to, I have one quick rapid fire question and Tina has one. Mine has to do with the future. So, what big developments are you anticipating over the next 12 months, either on the tech side or the policy side, that you think cities need to be anticipating? Why don't we start with you, Waldo? Because
more change, just a lot more change. I certainly hope that change means reduced power requirements, reduced carbon emissions, reduced expense. But we saw that wall breached a month ago, and I certainly hope that we're going to see a continuation of that. Simplicity isn't quite the right word, but reduction of all of those things. I think I anticipate that's what we're going to see over the next 12 months. I don't think that was a one-off thing. the circumstances under which that was made was by starving China of exports of GPUs. An accidental outcome there, but I hope a good one generally. So anyway, that's my forecast, is that is not going to be a one-off thing that happened a month ago, but that we see more developments like that.
Continued disruption. Katie, any thoughts on that?
I would say, so I can speak more from the policy side, where I'm expecting to see more, I guess, formal requirements coming out of legislation and state policy in terms of the adoption and use of artificial intelligence. So right now we have guidelines, and that's sort of where you start, and then you start getting into your requirements. And so that's where I expect to see more firm expectations in terms of the state's agencies' adoption and use of AI.
Great, thank you. And Santi?
I think making predictions makes for making big mistakes. So, like, I hope that I don't have to eat my words. This is recorded, so it's particularly intimidating. I think that the trend seems adding more data and more training seems to be plateauing in terms of the quality of the output. So I think there's going to continue to be change and improvements, but I think that you'll start seeing better open source models, better smaller models, and different types of techniques to try to bring smaller models that are, so generally I think the cost is going to go down. I don't think that we might see like these like crazy revolutionary increases in performance, but probably like better in performance around like different domains. And I think that that also means we have so much work in government to try to figure out like what the value is. And I think that in terms of the risk, the piece that is clear for cities and state is like maintaining our values. Like, we were doing things because we think that the right thing to do is to build technology for people, be responsible about cost, but also our employees are our people, they're our constituents. Like, we're not trying to build tools to try to replace them. We're trying to help them be more effective and more efficient. So I think that it is a matter of like, in a time of crisis and in a time of change, it's the time to double down around like, why is it that we're doing what we were doing? And it might not be as cool to do those things, but we're not doing them because we're trying to do cool, but because we thought that is the right thing to do.
I love that, because I think the last point just keeps us focused on what's the problem we're trying to solve, not the bright, shiny ways that we can go out of our way to solve them. Okay, last rapid fire question before we hit the top of the hour. For each of these webinars, I always ask folks for one piece of practical advice for cities that watch this webinar. So I'm going to ask each of you for one piece of practical advice for cities that are that have active tech procurements right now, or who are planning them when they might involve AI. So Waldo, coming to you first.
Understand it. Please take the time to understand what the heck you're buying. Otherwise, you're just an easy mark.
Katie.
So the emphasis that we've been trying to stress in the state is ongoing monitoring of outputs, just because we're seeing some, there may be model drift and those types of things. And I know that might be after the procurement, but it's not a like buy the thing one and done piece, especially for generative AI. So that's the piece that we're trying to really encourage the focus on, understanding how you're going to monitor, what the quality is, and then how you're going to fine tune. So
Love it. Santi, round us out.
I think to Waldo's point, the best way of understanding is to try it. Like, they're giving it away for free, like, so like within the boundaries of like knowing, like, if you're using data that's already open, if you're using documents that are already open, there's so much value and so many things that you can experiment with things that have very little risk that already are given. You can try it for free, learn how it works, and then think about how it might not work. And then maybe that informs about whether you want more of it, less of it, or how you want to buy it.
So I love that because in each of all three of those practical pieces of advice just involve becoming a better informed customer and using the power of being a customer within government to make sure you're getting what you're needing, what you need from folks who are trying to sell you, right? So understand what you're buying, understand what it's going to look like after the fact and monitoring, and try it first. Thank you, all three. Really appreciate the expertise you were able to share. The detailed, more engineering knowledge. Santi, I didn't understand some of that. And it's okay because then you paired it with practical advice. Katie, really appreciate you bringing that privacy lens to help us keep that front of mind. And Waldo, always appreciate sort of your very like pragmatic approach to, listen, you're the customer. Let's think about how to make sure you don't get locked into something that isn't in your interest. For everyone watching this recording, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Tech and Innovation Center series. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, folks.